From the very beginning of the Chapel of Christ, we have had communion every Sunday. We stopped communion over a year ago due to the coronavirus response, and we are beginning communion again today. And I thought for that reason it would be nice to take a look at communion. Now, communion is when Christians eat a small amount of some kind of bread and a small amount of wine or juice. It is called by different names. Some people call it the Lord's Supper. Some call it communion. Some call it Eucharist. The way communion is done varies greatly. If you've visited various churches and seen communion there, you've probably seen many different ways of doing it. Even among churches in the same denomination, there is great variety in the way communion is done. There's not only great variety in the way communion is done, there is great variety in the meanings that Christians attach to it. And there are many different ideas about how communion actually got started. Christians do not agree on the meaning of communion, and they do not agree on how it got started. Many believe the origin of communion is from a supper that Jesus ate with his disciples the night right before he was arrested. And churches who believe that generally will call it the Lord's Supper. It is reported in the New Testament and Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus takes bread, breaks it, and he says, "This is my body broken for you," and he gives the bread to his disciples. And then he takes a cup, and he says, "This is the blood, my blood, which is shed for you." And he gives them the cup, and they all drink of it. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, and only in the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus says those things, he adds, "This do in remembrance of me." The Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark do not have "this do in remembrance of me." And therefore, when Matthew and Mark present it, it is seen more as a one-time thing. When Luke presents it, it is seen as something that Jesus instituted that he wanted the disciples to continue to do. Now, oddly enough, the Gospel of John does not have any of this at all. The Gospel of John just simply says, "They ate supper." So the Gospel of Luke is the only Gospel that presents communion as something that Jesus did with the disciples with the intention that it would continue. Now, some Christians say this is the origin of communion, and within that idea, though, there is one major disagreement. Some maintain that this meal that Jesus ate with his disciples was a Passover meal. The Passover is a yearly Jewish celebration where they recount the plagues that God sent on the Egyptians back when the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. And the Passover is a meal that Jews eat to commemorate that. Now, the Gospels tell us that Jesus' arrest and crucifixion was around the time of the Passover, so some Christians look at this supper, this meal that Jesus had with his disciples that night, as a Passover meal. And they basically see communion as a variation on a Jewish Passover meal. However, there is disagreement about that. The Bible does not state this was a Passover meal. It says it happened around the time of the Passover. In addition, the Gospels of Mark and the Gospel of Luke tell us that this was on the day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which, as far as biblical scholars can determine, is not the day of the Passover. And given that, then we cannot say that it was a Passover meal that Jesus had with his disciples that night. At any rate, though, that is one of the ideas about the origin of communion, that it stems from this meal that Jesus had with his disciples shortly before he was arrested. There is another idea about the origin of communion, though, and some Christians say that is not it. Some point to a number of passages in the Gospels where it talks about Jesus eating with people. If you'll read the Gospels, you'll notice that there are a number of times in the Gospels where it shows Jesus eating with people. And the idea is that that set a pattern that Jesus ate with people a lot, and that set a pattern that his followers continued even after his ascension into heaven. People point to two things, especially from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, and these are after the resurrection. It shows Jesus eating with a group of his followers, and then he later eats with another group of followers. John chapter 21, it gives the account of where Jesus, after the resurrection, cooked bread and fish with the disciples and ate with them. And then Acts chapter 2, after the ascension of Jesus, tells us that the followers of Jesus often broke bread together. That is, they ate together. And these people put all this together and say that the origin of communion was that Jesus ate with people a lot, and his followers continued that, and then that later developed into what we know as communion, as a memorial or remembrance of Jesus. The argument for that is very persuasive when you look very closely at what the scriptures actually say. Remember, the Gospel of Luke is the only one that has the phrase, "This do in remembrance of me." We find that only one other place in the New Testament, and that was 1 Corinthians chapter 11 that I read to you earlier. And Paul says also there that Jesus said, "This do in remembrance of me." But Paul, if you notice when I read that, does not claim that he got that from Luke. Paul claims that he got that directly from Jesus himself. Now there's something we need to think about this. Although we look at Paul as being the main figure in Christianity after the time of Jesus, there were many Christians at that time that were not connected with Paul. There were lots of Christian groups that had never heard of Paul. And remember, there was no New Testament back then. That wouldn't come for 300 more years. What they did have was that various Christian groups in the different places had writings that they considered to be scripture. And they might not have necessarily had them all. Some might have had the Gospel of Luke. Some might have had the writings of Paul. Others may never have even heard of them. And so different Christians were doing different things back then. If you did not have the Gospel of Luke, and if you did not have the writings of Paul, you may have no way of knowing this do in remembrance of me. And so these Christians likely had communion just as something that they did because Jesus ate with people. That set a custom, and it continued. They got together and ate a meal together, just like you get together with family and friends and eat. And people didn't necessarily connect it with the death of Jesus. They didn't necessarily connect it with the meal that Jesus ate with his disciples shortly before his arrest. Now, eventually, this would have developed into a more formalized meal that was more than just a meal. It would be developed into a remembrance of Jesus. They would get together and eat and remember Jesus and remember what he did and remember some of the things that he said. And that caught on, apparently, and spread to other Christian groups. So we have two ideas about how communion developed. One says that it developed from something Jesus instituted on the night right before he was arrested. The other said that it developed from a tradition that Jesus started of eating with people. And that is something that his followers continued. In the final analysis, we don't know which one is right. Maybe neither one of them is. Maybe it has some other origin that we don't know about. The Bible does not tell us the origin of communion. Compounding the problem, not enough has survived in the historical record for us to know the origin of communion. The best we can do is say we do not know that the origin of communion is lost to history. Now, if the origin of communion is lost to history, do we then know what the earliest Christians did at communion? Again, we don't really know that either. The Bible gives us only some sketchy clues. There's only one description in the Bible that you can look at as being a description of what they did at communion, or at least the early communion the way it was, and that was our passage from 1 Corinthians 11, and that's about all. There's nothing else in the Bible about it, and even that passage doesn't mention much. It does talk about people bringing their own food, and it does talk about people not having any food. It talks about some being hungry and eating before everybody gets there, and it talks about some overdoing the liquor and getting drunk. So now Paul does talk about it being the body and blood representation of Jesus, but he doesn't tell us exactly how it is the body and blood representation. He does not explain that. That passage is the only place in the Bible that talks about actual communion, and it's only for one place, for these Christians in the city of Corinth. It seems to be some kind of covered dish supper type of thing, but at the same time it's more than that. It's some sort of memorial to Jesus. Now, we do not know what they did exactly in Corinth, but I think what we're seeing in that is we are seeing a process of development. We see that it seems to be a covered dish supper on one hand, and then we see that it's some kind of memorial to Jesus on the other hand, and I think what we're seeing there is that it is morphing from Christians just getting together to have to eat together like a covered dish meal. It is in the process of morphing from that into a religious ritual. Now, there's one other thing in the Bible we need to talk about, and this is a passage in the book of Jude. And Jude is talking about people who have, as he put it, crept in to Christianity and are teaching wrong things. And then he says this: there are spots in your love feasts, while they feast with you without fear, serving only themselves. Now, what a love feast in Christianity is anybody's guess, because that's the only mention of it in the Bible. Some people say, well, that's communion. But no one knows. You can't say it's communion because it's just called a love feast, and you cannot say that that had anything to do with communion. Remember, one of our rules is that we don't assume things. Because if we assume things about the Bible and our assumption is wrong, the whole thing collapses like a house of cards. Now, the bottom line is that just from the Bible, ignoring assumptions, there is no clear explanation or description of communion. From the historical record in the early years of Christianity, the first 100 years or so, we do not know much about what the Christians did back then. We know from the New Testament that the Christians in Corinth were doing something akin to some kind of communion service. We do not know if that was widespread or not done. We only know what they were doing. Now, around the year 100, though, we begin to find in the historical record writings that have survived that give a description of communion. And it is described as the Eucharist. And Eucharist simply means thanksgiving, to give thanks. And so that clues us in that among this group of Christians, what they were doing with communion was using it as a time to give thanks to God. Now, from another source, from about the year 150, there seems to have been a ritual that had developed among a certain group of Christians to do this. It is still called Eucharist, or to give thanks, and it was a fairly extensive ritual. It gave thanks for everything God had done for human beings. And of course, the main thing that Christians believe God did for human beings is what God did in Jesus. And so it was concentrated on giving thanks to God for what God did in Jesus. It had an emphasis on Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and ascension. In other words, everything Jesus did. Now, from this one source, we cannot tell if this was widespread or not. We just know that this one group did it. Now, sometimes it's really easy to make the mistake of thinking, okay, now we've got this writing survived from the year 150, and these Christians are doing this, so that means Christians all over the world were doing it. Well, it does not. Just because one group was doing something does not mean everybody was doing it. We simply do not know. However, by the mid-300s, we do know that a fixed practice of doing communion was fairly widespread within Christianity and had become the norm. Somehow, over the first 300 or so years of Christianity, a practice eventually developed over that period of time that would become the norm about the mid-300s. We're not sure how it developed, only that it did. The question is, why? Why did it develop? And why has it stayed with us for so long? In the early years, we've talked about in here before how Christianity spread so rapidly in its early years. In general, the people who became Christians had left other religions to become Christians, and the religions they left had rituals and observances associated with them. Every religion in the world has rituals and observances, regular things people do. A religion cannot be just a set of beliefs. Beliefs are abstracts. They're concepts. A religion has to be more than just abstracts and concepts. It has to include things that are concrete, things that you do, things that you see. That's why religions have services. That's why religions have observances or rituals. The meaning of the word ritual is just something you do on a regular basis. It might be coming to church. It might be a certain thing that you have a certain prayer time. A ritual might be giving offerings to the gods, lighting candles. Maybe it is saying the Ave Maria, paying homage to God in some way, something you do on a regular basis. All religions involve those things. Rituals are an essential part of religion. Beliefs are abstract, but rituals symbolize and act out beliefs. Rituals make beliefs into something concrete and something you do. An example would be, suppose you go to a concert, somebody's singing, and you sit there and you really enjoy the singing. And you're sitting there, you're thinking, gosh, I'm really enjoying this singing. When the concert's over, what usually happens is that people applaud. The applause makes the people's appreciation and enjoyment of the singing into something concrete. Before they applauded, they were just sitting there, and their enjoyment was an abstract, something that was not expressed. But the applause expresses it and makes it into something visible, something concrete. That's what rituals do. They express abstracts. Rituals seem to be a basic human need. Anthropologists tell us that they have found evidence of rituals in virtually every ancient human society. Recent scientific research has shown the importance of rituals. They impact our thoughts. They impact our feelings and behaviors. Rituals are ceremonies, in a sense, by which we connect to something. They make abstracts concrete. They take something that's just a thought and make it into an action, into something we do. They take the concept of God, whom we cannot see, and make it into something real. People need rituals. They need regular observances in their lives. They need regular observances in religion. No religion could survive if it were just abstract belief. It also needs rituals, things you do. It needs something to make it real. And eventually, communion became the defining ritual of Christianity. It became the main observance of Christianity. It was a way people practiced their religion. It provided a reason for Christians to gather together. There had to be some reason for Christians to gather together after all, you know. Otherwise it would just become a social gathering and would eventually peter out. The observance of the regular ritual of communion became the reason that Christians gathered in churches. And it was for many, many, many years, up until the Protestant Reformation, the main activity that went on inside churches. Communion takes what are abstract beliefs and makes it into something concrete, something people do on a regular basis. Now, because communion is something the Bible does not itself outline or provide directions for or meaning for, over the years people have attached a million different meanings to it, and they've come up with a million different ways to do it. Every church I've ever been in does it in a different way. Every minister I've ever seen does it in a different way. If you want to know what the meaning of communion is, it depends on which day you ask, because it changes with the wind. The meaning a particular church puts on it today may not be the meaning they put on it next week. It changes very often. Communion feels a need within us for religious observances. It also feels a need within us to get together and do something with other Christians, to feel like we're part of a group. And so communion is something that we do as a group. But yet I believe it is the most intensely personal of all the Christian rituals, because each person attaches their own meaning to it. You will not look at communion the same way the person in front or behind you looks at it, and that's okay. It is something that's personal. We do it together, and we do it in a certain way, but each one of us gets from it something personal to ourselves. And maybe we can look at it as that each one of us gets from it what God needs for us to get. It's something we do as a group in a certain way, but yet to each one of us, it will have its own unique meaning. And that's the way it should be.